He went into Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw, that is, when Sarai saw that Hagar had conceived, her mistress was despised in her eyes, in her sight. Verse 5. So Sarai said to Abram, may the wrong done to me be upon you. I gave my maid into your arms, but when she saw that she had conceived, I was despised in her sight. May the Lord judge between you and me. And Sarai is upset with her husband Abram. And the reason why she is because Abram listened to her. Abram went into the maiden and produced a child, and that was the intention. But when that occurred, now she's upset with Abram. And she says, may God judge between you and me, she says. May the wrong done to me. Well, if there was wrong, you were the one who initiated it. This was your cockamamie idea, to have Abram go into the... But what I want you to see is that Hagar, this Egyptian maid to Sarah, Hagar is called a wife, just like Sarah is a wife. Now, continuing this story, we turn to chapter 21 of Genesis. And you know, eventually, Sarah has a child of her own, well past the normal time of childbirth. And we read in Genesis 21 at verse 8, and this child is Isaac, the child that's born to Abraham and Sarah. And the child grew and was weaned. Weaned mean he was taken off of milk. And they didn't have bottles with formulas in those days. This would be breast milk. And in the culture of that time, that happened somewhere around the age of 3, long after a child has teeth. But that's because they didn't have refrigeration. That's usually when it occurred. And this was a big deal in those Oriental cultures when a child was weaned. And we see that in verse 8. And the child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. All the servants in that massive household were going to celebrate this wonderful transition from being a baby to being a child. And the distinction was you were no longer needed to suckle. Verse 9. Now Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, mocking. Sarah saw Ishmael mocking the son, her son, who's 3 years old. Ishmael is 13. A teenager mocking a 3-year-old. Verse 10. Therefore she said to Abraham, drive out this maid. Well, yeah, from Sarah's perspective, it's a maid. Hagar's a maid. But from Abraham's perspective, that's another wife. Drive out this maid and her son, for the son of this maid shall not be an heir with my son Isaac. Verse 11, and the matter distressed Abraham greatly because of his son, whom he loved, Ishmael, 13 years of age. Get rid of him. I want a divorce. I want her out of here permanently, Sarah says. You would think that Abram would say to him, now listen, I know this is an emotional time for you. Big party here, we're all kind of revved up and excited about this. But Ishmael, he's a 13-year-old boy. He's not even a man, he's just a youth. He's a wee bit jealous because of the big party, and just forget about it. You're the adult here. Let's just push that off to the side. But God comes down to handle the situation. One would suspect that God would come down, pull Sarah aside privately, as it were, and talk to her and say, now listen, you've got to get over this. You can't break up a marriage here just because you were jealous, just because you were upset. I mean, that's the advice I think God would give to Sarah. But look what God did say. Verse 12. But God said to Abraham, do not be distressed because of the lad and your maid, your wife, Hagar. Whatever Sarah tells you, listen to her. For through Isaac your descendants shall be made. Sarah said, I want you to divorce Hagar, your wife. Get rid of her. And God comes down and says, listen to your wife. Divorce Hagar. Get rid of her. I don't know about you, but that sends my little brain in kind of a tailspin here. I'm saying that didn't go the way I thought it was going to go. I thought God would have reassured Abraham, listen, you have 2 wives. You have responsibility to both of them. Under no circumstances should you divorce Hagar because your wife is upset. But God says, get rid of her. And there's a marriage broken just like that. Whoa. But this event in Genesis is pre-law. It's before God gave the law to his covenant people, Israel. So what we need to do is ask this question. When Jesus said, whoever sends his wife away, what constitutes a wife? Let me add to your consternation this morning. Let me go back and give you a hypothetical situation from the Old Testament under the law. And we'll assume in a small town over here are 4 ladies who are good friends, and they want to go out and pick some berries that day. They've heard that the blueberries are just absolutely ripe and delicious. And they know that there's a blueberry patch about 1.5 miles outside of the city walls of their town, has lots of blueberries. It's down in a valley. Hardly anybody knows about it. So these 4 ladies take their little baskets, good-sized baskets, and they're going to spend the day picking blueberries. And they do. They make the little trip to the big blueberry patch in the valley, and the bushes are loaded. And they're picking blueberries, laughing and talking. You know, girl talk, when girls get together, what they talk about. So they're picking these berries and having a wonderful time, eating berries, but filling up their baskets. Unbeknownst to those 4 ladies picking berries, over on the side, hiding behind some bushes, are 4 men from another town on the other side of the valley. And these 4 men have been oogling at these 4 ladies. And while these ladies are just about finished picking their berries, they hear shouts, and they look up, and there's 4 men rushing to them. And these are 4 wicked men. These 4 men rape those 4 women. Humiliating, painful. These ladies go back completely demoralized. They have been traumatized by this event. They walk back to their town. They're sobbing when they get into town. They tell the elders of the town what happened. The elders immediately leave as a group to go to that neighboring town over there where they think the rapists were living. And they make inquiries, and sure enough, the 4 rapists, those men, are in that town. And so, living under the law of Moses, those 4 men are brought to justice. The man who raped the woman who was a married woman is stoned to death. In that group of ladies, there was another one who was betrothed, more than our engagement, but she was anticipating being married at a designated time, only a couple months away from her official ceremony. The man who raped the betrothed woman, he also was taken out and stoned to death. One of those 4 ladies was a slave, and the guy that raped her, well, he has to offer a guilt offering, an animal sacrifice, and he's free. His conscience is clean, and he walks away. The 4th girl was a young virgin, a relatively young teenage girl. She's a virgin, not betrothed, but she was raped. And the guy that raped her may have the opportunity or the responsibility to marry her after he pays her father 50 shekels of silver. So it all depends upon what this teenage girl, the virgin's dad, says about the situation. He may say, 50 shekels, that's a lot of silver. And you know, that would be 1 less mouth to feed in the family. Yeah, you raped her, she's your bride. I want the 50 shekels of silver. Now we look at that. That's all taken from verses from the Old Testament text. And we say, wow, that causes me some confusion. It seems like a rape is a rape and it should be the same punishment. But God designated differences. So I want to know what constitutes a woman becoming a wife. What's the point of transaction? On your notes, there are two major possibilities. Some think it is the initial sex act. That's what constitutes marriage. You say, really? Where would they get an idea like that? Well, here's two verses. In Genesis 2:24, the first wedding ceremony, we would say, officiated by God himself to Adam and to Eve. And God says, "For this cause a man shall leave his father and mother, and shall cleave," the word means glued, "to his wife, and they shall become one flesh." Now this statement, although made to Adam and Eve, wasn't specifically talking about Adam and Eve, Adam in particular, because he didn't have a father or a mother to leave. So this was to be passed down to Adam and Eve's children and grandchildren. We say this is the formula for marriage. You leave parents, whether that's physically moving out of their house or whether that's leaving in an emotional dependent state. You leave them, you glue yourself to your wife, and the two of you become one flesh. Didn't say one name, that she drops her maiden name and assumes her husband's last name. No. Doesn't say they become one mind. They've been living together for so long that they can finish each other's sentences. This says they become one flesh. So what does that mean? We have a commentary in 1 Corinthians 6. Paul chiding the Christian men in the church at Corinth. He says, "Or do you not know that the one who joins himself to a harlot is one body with her?" There was a temple prostitutes in the city of Corinth. It was the largest temple prostitute to that goddess Artemis, I think it was. And men would come from all over that region to that temple to partake of the harlots that were there as an act of worship. And apparently some of the men in Corinth were still doing that. When you join yourself to a harlot, you become one body with her. And then Paul proves his point by quoting Genesis 2. "For God says, the two shall become one flesh." A man who goes into a bride where they've been planning for the last 18 months to have an official ceremony, they've done everything according to the Christian standards. They are virgins going into their wedding day. They become one flesh in the sight of God, we say. Same as the man who goes into a harlot. A harlot who says her name is Bunny. Yeah, I'll bet it's Bunny. He doesn't know anything about her. He doesn't know her age, doesn't know where he came from, doesn't know her family name, doesn't know anything about her. She's a harlot. But he's in a one flesh relationship, as well as the ideal Christian couple who have a official wedding ceremony. Both of them are said to be one flesh. Here's some other verses that would seem to indicate that. Genesis 16. Abram's wife Sarah took Hagar, the Egyptian, her maid, and gave her to her husband as his wife. And he went into Hagar. So when Abram and Hagar became married, what was it? Was there a rabbi called for an official religious ceremony? The implication seems to be he went into her, and that's how she became his wife. Genesis 24, then Isaac brought her, Rebekah, into his mother's tent. Remember, she came from a long distance. She came, and she was a stranger to him. They'd never met. The father's servant found this wife. And it says, Isaac brought Rebekah into his mother's tent. He pulled back the tent flap, and what was inside of there, do you suppose? Or a rabbi, of course. There was a band, there was friends, there was a buffet laid out. No, because she arrived unexpectedly. What was in the mother's tent? A bed? Some furniture? He took Rebekah and she became his wife. And he loved her. He didn't love her before, not personally, not individually. He never met her before. But he went into the mother's tent and she became his wife. I don't have time to read the rest of those verses, but you can read them yourselves. Oh, well, here's an argument against that view. John chapter 4, Jesus is talking with a Samaritan woman. And he asked about her husband, and she said, well, I have no husband. And Jesus said to this woman, you have well said, I have no husband. For you have had 5 husbands, and the one whom you now have is not your husband. You've had 5 official husbands before. They died or divorced, whatever, I'm not sure. You have a guy now that you're with, but he's not your husband. So the argument is, marriage must be more than just the sex act. If she's had this fellow and Jesus said he's not your husband. Mark chapter 6. For John had been saying to Herod, it's not lawful for you to have your brother Philip's wife. Shouldn't Jesus have said it's not right for you to have your brother's former wife? Because Herodias has now been living with Herod for years. As far as as far as John the Baptist was concerned, Herodias was still married to Philip, even though she's been living in the palace with Herod for a couple of years. Second argument as to what constitutes marriage. Some say it's really a verbal agreement, a covenant, if you please. Malachi chapter 2. Because the Lord has been a witness between you and the wife of your youth, against whom you have dealt treacherously, though she is your companion, and here it is, and your wife by covenant. She made that transition from being single to being a married woman, a wife, because of the covenant that was made, a verbal promise to one another. Proverbs 2, the adulteress that flatters with her words, that leaves the companion of her youth and forgets the covenant of her God. Whenever I perform wedding ceremonies, I like to remind the bride and groom and the audience that this is a covenant not just between the male and female standing before you on the stage. It's also a covenant that you make with God in the presence of these family and friends. And here's the adulteress that forgets the covenant of marriage that she made with God. I shan't take the time to read the other 2 verses, but look an argument against that view. It seems highly unlikely that a captive woman, that incident recorded in Deuteronomy 21, if you go in to a city and you conquer it, you are to kill every man, woman, and child. But if you're a soldier and you see a woman there that you find attractive, and you say, I want that woman to be my wife, don't kill her, you tell your fellow soldiers. Then she has to come back to your house. She removes her clothing, foreign clothing. You give her Jewish dresses, whatever those are. And she mourns for her parents for 30 days. She witnessed you come in with your sword with some fellow men and hack her mom and dad to death, her 3 older sisters, and her 2 brother-in-laws, all taking safety in the confines of that house. She witnessed that traumatic event. Now she comes to this Jewish man's house. She can't speak his language. She doesn't know his culture. She has this thought in her mind, this nightmare that she relives again and again. This is the guy that was responsible for the death of my immediate family. And at the end of 30 days, he says, okay, now we're going to become husband and wife. Do you think she would enter into a covenant bond with this man? How about the woman that was raped? We just talked about that illustration at the outset. Or a kidnapped woman in Judges chapter 21, where the men that remained, the remnant from Benjamin, came running out of the bushes and grabbed these women that were there for the festival of the wine. Do you think any of them would enter into a voluntary covenant with a person who has traumatized them like that? I don't know. Well, we turn to really the heart of our study. Jesus said in our text that we begin with, "You have heard that it was said in the Old Testament, whoever sends his wife away, let him give her a certificate of divorce." So this is how God prescribes that weddings were to be terminated under the law. And there's our text that Jesus is quoting from. It's in the box. "When a man takes a wife and marries her, and it happens..." Oh, well, let's time out. What do you mean, and it happens? It happens a week after the marriage? A month? A year? A decade? Well, there's no time parameters mentioned here. It says, "And it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes." He's not pleased with her. And why isn't he pleased with her? Well, it says, because he, the husband, has found some indecency in her. So he's upset with this wife that he's taken. It happens that he's found this indecency in her. And when that occurs, he writes her a certificate of divorce, and he puts it in her hand and sends her out of the house. Sends her away, sends her out of the house. That's what is referred to as a divorce. He gives her a certificate of divorcement, personally presents it to her, and he says out. And that's it. The marriage is done. That's what God prescribes. So let's look at this procedure, if we could. Oh, wait, before we do, on the very back of your notes, side 4, you will see a Jewish certificate of divorce. Now that's an ancient, going back in the years or centuries BC, but I'm not sure when it was written, and I couldn't find any confirmation as to when this was actually penned, but this was at least a later certificate of divorce after the commandment here in Deuteronomy 24. So let's look at the procedure. These are the steps that had to be followed to have a divorce in the Old Testament. Number 1, the rabbis thought that it was the husband's, and only the husband's, prerogative to initiate the divorce. Because the Old Testament text, we'll be looking at a couple of them here, always is from a male perspective. There's the verse in Deuteronomy 24 in the box. When a man takes a wife, he puts it into her hand. He sends her out. And the rabbi said, well, it must be that God wants only men to have that privilege, that right, that prerogative to divorce. The women doesn't have that. It's interesting, we'll see in next week's study, Jesus Christ and the Apostle Paul, writing in 1 Corinthians 7, talks about a woman having that prerogative, that she can take the initiative to break the marriage. Number 2, the procedure. The reason for the divorce was his displeasure for his wife. He just doesn't like her, or maybe he doesn't like what she's constantly doing, but he's displeased with her. This is not what I thought I was getting, he says, in essence. Displeasure. Now look, let me take that same word and give it to you in other places. In Exodus 21, this is in regards to a man marrying a slave. If she is displeasing in the eyes of her master, who designated her for himself, then he shall let her be redeemed. He does not have authority to sell her to a foreign people because of his dealing treacherously with her. Here's a man who has a slave. He bought her in the slave market, and he says, I want her for my wife. And he takes this slave that is now his wife, and he's displeased with her. she can go out of that marriage relationship, but he can't sell her as a slave again to some other people or to a Jewish person. She walks out of that marriage relationship because he's displeased with her. She's a free woman. Here's another one, Deuteronomy 21. This is a captive. And it shall be that if you are not pleased with her, this captive woman, then you shall let her go wherever she wishes. You went into her house, you killed all of her family, but you designated her, you kept her alive, you brought her in, you married her after a month's waiting period, but you're displeased with her. She's a lousy cook. She can't seem to get the idea of Jewish cooking here. Matzo ball soup. I like a matzo ball soup. And she can't do that. He's displeased with her. She can go out wherever she wishes. She's free. The marriage is snapped. It's broken. But the text we're looking at there, Deuteronomy 24 in the box, when a man takes a wife and marries her, and it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes because the reason why she has no favor in his eyes because he found some indecency in her. So there's the basis for this case, anyhow, of breaking a marriage, indecency. What is indecency? The word literally means nakedness of thing. That's reading it in the Hebrew. He's displeased with her because he's found some nakedness of thing. What is that talking about? Well, wait a minute. This word, translated indecency, is found one other time. It's in the same book of Deuteronomy. Would you open that to chapter 23? And maybe we'll get an understanding of what indecency is. Let's pick up the context, Deuteronomy 23. Starting in verse 12. You shall also have a place outside the camp, and go out there, and you shall have a spade, a shovel, among your tools. And it shall be that when you sit down outside, you shall dig with that spade, you dig a hole, and shall turn to cover up your excrement. Boy Scout parlance, we call this a latrine. You dig a hole, you have your bowel movement, and then you cover the dirt for sanitary purposes. That's what God is telling them here. Verse 14. Since the Lord your God walks in the midst of your camp to deliver you and to defeat your enemies before you, therefore your camp must be holy, and he, that is God, who walks amongst you, he must not see anything indecent. Oh, this is the only other time this word's used. And do you see what the indecent thing is that God must not see? That you are expected to dig a hole and cover it over? It's excrement. So that doesn't make any sense either. Deuteronomy 24. And if she finds no favor in his eyes because he's found some excrement? No. What is that talking about? You know, in the first century, you have Jesus Christ is confronted, and we'll look at this next week, by some Pharisees that come to him with one of those trick questions. And they ask him, can a man put away his wife for any cause at all? And what you might not understand here is that in that first century, there was raging between two schools of thought about the reason for divorce. There was a well-known rabbi named Shammai said the only reason why you are allowed to divorce your wife is for immorality. There was a liberal rabbi named Hillel who had large numbers of followers, and he said, listen, these are some of the reasons by which a Jewish man can divorce his wife And it falls into that little verse, indecency, disfavor. Number one, if she ruins a dish of food by burning it, you're cooking over an open flame, maybe wood, more likely camel or cow dung. It's hard to regulate heat over an open flame. It's easy to burn food, just like that. 17 years of good food preparation. One time she was distracted and came back and the food was burned. That's ground for divorce. Number two, if she over-seasons the food, he could divorce her. Some spices are very mild. Some spices, just a pinch too much, would probably be considered over-seasoning. She causes a husband to eat food that was not tithe. That's grounds for divorce. If she's a poor housekeeper, well, of course she's a poor housekeeper. She has 3 kids under the age of 5. She's in a whirlwind taking care of those kids all day. He comes home from his job and the house a little disheveled. Well, she's been running herself ragged taking care of those 3 young ones. If she talks with other men in a way that he finds to be too familiar, she treats her in-laws with disrespect. If she's talking loudly so the neighbors can hear, they didn't have panes of glass in those days. Windows were wide open. There may have been a little cloth curtain to cover it, but if you're living in a city environment, the neighbor's house is just a spit away. You know what I mean? Of course, neighbors could hear her talking. Brawling with her husband. Do you remember several months ago we were studying about Methodist? We were considering John and Charles Wesley in Whitefield. Do you remember John Wesley married a woman named Molly? They had a cantankerous marriage. One of the Wesley's friends was coming for a visit that night, and as he approached the house of John and Molly, he heard this yelling and screaming. He thought it was a robbery. He ran and peeked through the windows, and he saw Molly Wesley had a hold of her husband's hair, and she was dragging him across the floor. Yeah, that would seem like grounds for divorce for me. And no, I'm bald, not because my wife has been pulling my hair out. It has nothing to do with it. Hillel said, if the woman was spinning in the street, and I tried to reference this, I don't know if it means spinning like this, or she had spinning she was doing with threads, I'm not sure. But there were all sort of frivolous reasons. Here's another rabbi, Rabbi Akiba. Divorce was permitted, according to Rabbi Akiba, if the husband finds another woman more beautiful than his wife. Think about that one, ladies, huh? You're walking down the street with your husband, and you're looking at this woman. Is she prettier than me? Was he looking at her? You'd be terrified that there's got to be somebody out there that's more attractive than me. Especially as you got middle-aged and older, right? That would just make you neurotic, I should think. But getting back to our notes. Number 3 on the top of that 3rd page. When Deuteronomy 24 was given, you have to understand that most Jewish men at that time were illiterate. Thus, for them to present a written certificate of divorce, they would have to go to someone who could write. In Deuteronomy 24, it would invariably be the priest at that point who could read, who could write. You would hope that the priest would try to talk this guy out of his frivolous divorce because he's not pleased with his wife. Number 4, the Jewish husband would have to experience the emotional turmoil of presenting the certificate of divorce to his wife and then sending her out of the house. You see, nowadays we do that through lawyers. We don't even have to see the wife after we've decided we want a divorce. The lawyers handle it all, right? No, God said, if you're going to divorce her, you need to look her in the eyes. You need to be a man. You need to tell her that you're ruining her life, and probably the life of your children. Number 5, this certificate would protect the wife from defamation. No one could accuse her of being too friendly with some other guy. She could say, no, I have a certificate of divorce. Right here it is. I'm looking for a husband. I make no qualms about it. I want to be married again. Here's some other things. There are 2 cases where God said men could not divorce. If a husband accused his wife of not being a virgin when they were married, and it was proven, you'll want to go back and read that portion, it was proven by the wife's parents. They had proof that their daughter was a virgin on the day that she was married. And they bring that out. They present it to the elders who listen to trials like this, and they say, this man has defamed the name of our daughter. And that man who made that lie up about his wife, he could never, ever, ever divorce her, no matter how displeased he was. Second one is a husband who raped a virgin whom he had to marry. He could never divorce her. There are 2 examples in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah that pressured men to divorce, that made them divorce their wives. The one in Nehemiah, look at that. Nehemiah forcefully, by forcefully he tells us, he brags about this in the writing. He said, I contended with them, I cursed them, I struck them, I pulled out their hair, I made them swear to God that they would divorce their wives who were from Ashdod. Ashdod was the Philistines. Jews should never have married Philistines. They were from Ammon and Moab. Wait, Ammonites and Moabites were Jewish. These were the sons of Lot. They were part of the family. Ruth was a Moabitess. Nehemiah, you knucklehead, you made these guys divorce from wives that were Moabites and Ammonites? No. That was wrong, definitely wrong. Next one, providential divorce. Did you know that there are 2 portions in the Old Testament where God himself was divorced? And those are the verses. Isaiah 50, he divorced from Judah and he divorced from Israel. He sent them away. That's the terminology for divorce. Some Christians want you to believe that all divorces, every divorce, any divorce is wicked. It's sinful in and of itself. Well, those who believe that are going to be hard-pressed to explain the fact that God himself divorced from his wives, plural. You know, God is portrayed as being polygamous, having multiple wives simultaneously. 3 verses there that tell you that. God says, I hate divorce. That settles it. God hates it. It's wrong. No, they love to quote that portion of the verse from Malachi 2:16, where God says, I hate divorce. But God doesn't hate all divorces. Only those that are treacherous. And you go back and read Malachi 2:16 in its context. He repeatedly says, when you deal treacherously with your wife, those are the kind of divorces that I hate. Pairing after divorce. If you read on page 4 of the notes, that ancient Jewish certificate of divorce, it clearly states in there they expected the woman who was divorced to go out and remarry. Deuteronomy 24 says this, and if she leaves her husband's house and goes and becomes another man's wife, and it is assumed that if she is divorced, she will remarry. This would have been the time for God to say, if you're divorced once, that's it. You don't get any second marriage. It goes on to say in verses 2 and 3 of that, She's divorced from her first husband. She goes over here and marries another man. It's expected that she would, assume that she would. If she's divorced from this one, she cannot go back and remarry the first husband. That defiles the land. And the stipulation under the law is that you can't remarry a former spouse if they've been married in the intermediate time. Jeremiah chapter 3, God says, if a husband divorces his wife and she goes from him and belongs to another man, God says that if she goes and becomes wife to another man, will he still return to her? Will not the land be completely polluted? And that's that principle that you cannot remarry. But God assumes that she will go and be remarried. Under the old covenant, remarriage was permitted. That's the bottom line. But in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, but I say to you. Next week's study is his requirements under the new covenant much more stringent than under the old. Under the old, thou shalt not murder. Under the new, you call person names. That's just as bad as murdering. Under the old covenant, you shall not commit the physical act of adultery. Under the new covenant, you lust. You've committed adultery. Under the old covenant, if you divorce, but I say to you, is it going to be more stringent than the Old Testament? Or is there a measure of grace? Well, next week, your notes will tell you. If I die between now and next week, the notes are there. Just print them off, anyone that wants them. If you can't make it next week, pick up a copy afterwards. What does the New Testament, what does Christ say about divorce? And once again, to my embarrassment, I'm 5 minutes late. Deduct that from my pay. That's who's ever responsible, deduct that. That's not right. Let's close in prayer. Father, if the statistics are true that half of the marriages in this country end in divorce, then there's a lot of people, a lot of Christians, who bear emotional scars from that. Thank you that you are the God who runs to the aid of your people. Would you do that with gracious words from the Scriptures to give them the reassurance that they need? Thank you for those of us who are married, happily married. Father, we bless your name for that privilege. To those here this morning who are not married and have that as the yearning of their heart, would you be pleased to give them the desire of their heart as they seek your face? And we'll thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.